A waitress has no business talking about global strategy. The sentence drifted across the private dining room just loudly enough for everyone to hear, followed by a few restrained smiles from executives who believed expensive suits made them experts on everything. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished walnut tables, while the skyline of Manhattan shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows like a kingdom built on ambition. Waiters moved quietly between conversations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Investors compared market forecasts over aged bourbon, and cameras from the business press waited outside for the announcement everyone expected before the night was over. Ethan Carter, the 42-year-old billionaire founder and CEO of Carter Global Holdings, stood at the center of it all with the calm confidence of a man who had spent 2 decades buying companies larger than the dreams of the people who ran them. His reputation stretched from New York to Singapore. Analysts called him brilliant. Competitors called him relentless. Employees simply called him the man who never lost. Tonight's dinner wasn't just another celebration. It was the final negotiation before a multinational logistics partnership that financial reporters estimated could reshape international shipping throughout North America, Europe, and Asia. Every executive in the room understood the stakes. Every executive except, apparently, the young waitress quietly refilling water glasses. Maya Johnson had worked at the restaurant for less than a year. 25 years old, graceful without trying to impress anyone. She wore the same pressed white shirt, bright red apron, black name tag, and comfortable work shoes as every other server on the floor. Most guests barely looked at her face. They noticed the tray, the coffee, the wine, the check. They rarely noticed the thoughtful eyes constantly observing the conversations unfolding around her. Maya preferred it that way. Invisible people often heard the truth before anyone else did. As another course arrived, a heated discussion broke out between several executives over international tariffs, shipping corridors, and a costly delay involving a European supplier. Charts appeared on tablets. Voices grew louder. One vice president confidently insisted the proposed expansion into Southeast Asia would eliminate the problem entirely. Another disagreed, predicting millions in avoidable losses. Ethan listened without interrupting, fingers resting calmly against a crystal glass. Then his attention shifted for only a moment toward Maya as she placed fresh, sparkling water beside him. "Don't worry about this conversation," he said politely, though the faint smile in his voice carried something colder beneath it. International business isn't exactly dinner-table conversation for waitstaff. Several guests chuckled softly. Nobody intended cruelty. At least that's what they told themselves. Maya simply nodded. "Of course, sir," she answered with the same calm professionalism she offered every guest. She neither defended herself nor looked embarrassed. She stepped away, collected an empty plate, and continued working as though nothing had happened. But one guest sitting quietly near the end of the table noticed something unusual. An older woman representing a respected investment firm watched Maya pause briefly beside the service station. Not to cry, not to complain. Instead, she glanced at one of the financial maps displayed across the room for barely 2 seconds before returning to work with the peaceful confidence of someone who had recognized a familiar mistake. It lasted no longer than a heartbeat, yet something about that expression lingered in the investor's mind. Outside, rain began tapping gently against the glass walls overlooking the city. Inside, conversations continued, unaware that the smallest voice in the room had already seen a problem worth hundreds of millions of dollars before anyone seated at the table had even realized it existed. Sometimes power speaks first. Wisdom waits. And before this extraordinary evening reached its end, everyone in that room would learn the difference. Before we continue, if you enjoy unforgettable stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary moments, subscribe to Hidden Tables. Every story reminds us that true character is revealed through courage, compassion, and the choices we make when no one is watching. Now, let's see what happens next. The dinner moved forward with the polished rhythm that only the wealthiest gatherings seemed to master. Plates disappeared without anyone noticing. Fresh glasses appeared before they were requested. Conversations flowed from artificial intelligence to currency fluctuations, from shipping insurance to election forecasts overseas. Maya Johnson crossed the room with practiced precision, never interrupting, never lingering longer than necessary. Yet every sentence she overheard quietly assembled itself inside her mind like pieces of a puzzle she had solved years before. Most people assumed she was simply listening because she happened to be nearby. They never imagined she actually understood the language of supply chains, international regulations, exchange rates, and cross-border negotiations. Ethan Carter leaned back as the lead consultant projected another series of colorful charts onto a large display. Red arrows pointed toward projected growth across Southeast Asia, while optimistic revenue estimates filled the screen. Around the table, confident heads nodded in agreement. One executive proudly explained that shifting distribution away from a major European port would reduce transportation costs by nearly 18% within 18 months. Another applauded the recommendation, calling it the safest expansion strategy available. Only the elderly investor sitting quietly near the window remained unconvinced. Margaret Holloway had spent 40 years investing in international manufacturing, and experience had taught her that confidence and accuracy were rarely identical twins. She glanced across the room toward Maya once again. The young waitress was serving coffee with the same calm expression she had worn all evening. Yet every time the presentation advanced, her eyes returned briefly to the map before moving on. It was almost as if she were mentally correcting something no one else could see. Margaret finally spoke. "Ethan, may I ask a question?" The room immediately settled. Ethan respected Margaret's judgment more than almost anyone in finance. "Of course," he replied. She folded her hands together. "Has anyone stress-tested these projections against next year's shipping compliance revisions?" A brief silence followed. The consulting team exchanged uncertain looks before one analyst answered carefully. "We accounted for the current regulations." Margaret raised an eyebrow. Current regulations are not always tomorrow's reality. The atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. Confidence gave way to calculation. Tablets reopened. Executives searched through spreadsheets. Ethan watched quietly as uncertainty spread across faces that had looked perfectly certain only moments earlier. Meanwhile, Maya carried another tray toward the kitchen entrance. As she passed the presentation screen, she noticed one figure highlighted in blue. She paused for less than a second. The consultant had based an entire forecast on an outdated trade corridor that would soon face stricter customs processing. The mistake was subtle. Most people would never recognize it. But once someone noticed it, the entire projection began to unravel. Maya continued walking without saying a word. She reminded herself why she never interfered. She was there to work, not to lecture billionaires. Years earlier she had learned that people often rejected the truth when it arrived wearing the wrong uniform. Still, the numbers stayed with her. She could almost hear one of her former professors repeating the same lesson from graduate school. International business rewards preparation, not assumptions. Back inside the dining room, Ethan noticed the discussion becoming increasingly fragmented. For the first time that evening, he removed his attention from the presentation and looked across the room toward the quiet waitress clearing dessert plates. She carried herself with unusual composure, untouched by the growing tension surrounding the negotiation. He could not explain why, but something about her calm confidence no longer looked ordinary. It looked familiar, like the quiet certainty of someone who already knew where the conversation was heading while everyone else was still trying to catch up. Margaret Holloway did not take her eyes off Maya Johnson as the young waitress disappeared briefly through the kitchen doors. Experience had taught her that true expertise often revealed itself in moments so small that everyone else overlooked them. She had built fortunes by noticing details that others dismissed, and tonight that same instinct whispered that something unusual had just happened. Inside the dining room, the consultants hurried through spreadsheets, while quiet conversations replaced the confident speeches from only minutes earlier. One analyst adjusted a forecast. Another recalculated projected costs. A third insisted the model remained accurate despite the growing uncertainty. Ethan Carter listened patiently, but the certainty he had displayed all evening had begun to fade. The presentation no longer felt like a victory lap. It felt like a puzzle with one missing piece. In the kitchen, Maya carefully arranged fresh coffee cups onto a polished silver tray. Around her, Cooks called out orders, plates clattered against stainless steel counters, and steam drifted through the warm air. Everything looked ordinary, yet her thoughts remained fixed on the map she had seen in the dining room. The projected shipping route depended on customs processing times that would change within months because of an international compliance agreement already scheduled to take effect. The data itself was not completely wrong. It was simply no longer complete. That difference could cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Maya quietly reminded herself that none of it was her responsibility. She had learned that lesson years earlier. Intelligence without credibility was often mistaken for arrogance. And credibility, she had discovered, was usually measured by titles instead of truth. She returned to the dining room carrying fresh coffee. As she approached the table, one consultant sighed with visible frustration. "We are missing something," he admitted. "The numbers worked yesterday." Margaret smiled gently. Sometimes the world changes faster than spreadsheets. A few people laughed politely, although nobody seemed relaxed anymore. Ethan accepted a fresh cup from Maya and thanked her with professional courtesy. Before she stepped away, his eyes drifted toward the folder tucked beneath her serving tray. It was not a restaurant manual. Across its edge, he noticed the words International Trade Review printed in bold blue letters. Maya realized what he had seen and calmly slid the folder farther beneath the tray. It belonged to an online certification course she had been studying during breaks between shifts. Ethan frowned for only a moment before returning his attention to the discussion. The image lingered in his mind. Why would a waitress spend her free time reading journals about global commerce? Margaret noticed the brief exchange as well. She waited another minute before speaking again. "Ethan, perhaps we are asking the wrong people the right question." Several executives looked confused. One consultant forced a smile. "What do you mean?" Margaret slowly glanced toward Maya, who had already begun clearing another table across the room. "I mean that observation is not limited by job titles." The room fell strangely quiet. Nobody responded immediately. Some executives looked uncomfortable with the suggestion. Others appeared amused by it. Ethan remained thoughtful. His reputation had been built on listening to unconventional ideas before anyone else recognized their value. Yet even he struggled to imagine that the quiet waitress serving dinner might understand the complexities of multinational logistics better than the specialists sitting around his table. Still, one fact refused to disappear. She had looked at the presentation with the calm expression of someone recognizing an obvious mistake rather than seeing complicated information for the first time. Outside, the rain continued falling softly against the towering windows, while thousands of lights stretched across the Manhattan skyline. Inside, an invisible line had begun to shift. The room still believed expertise belonged to the people wearing tailored suits, but doubt had quietly entered the conversation. And for the first time that evening, Ethan Carter found himself wondering whether the most valuable perspective in the room had been standing beside him all along, carrying nothing more than a coffee tray and the confidence to remain silent. No one volunteered another answer. The silence around the table carried more weight than the presentation itself. Every executive suddenly understood that confidence alone would not close a deal of this size. Ethan Carter slowly stood and walked toward the digital display, studying the shipping routes one more time. He had reviewed similar presentations hundreds of times throughout his career, yet something continued bothering him. It was not the numbers. It was the certainty with which everyone defended them. The best business decisions, he had learned, rarely came from people who believed they could not possibly be wrong. Across the room, Maya Johnson quietly replaced dessert forks with fresh coffee spoons, careful not to interrupt the discussion. Her movements remained calm and professional, but inside she wrestled with an increasingly familiar dilemma. She could continue saying nothing and watch experienced consultants approve a strategy built on incomplete assumptions, or she could risk embarrassing people whose careers had been built on their expertise. Neither choice felt comfortable. Her grandmother had always told her that wisdom meant knowing when to speak. Experience had taught Maya something different. Wisdom also meant knowing when silence protected everyone's pride. Ethan turned back toward the table. "Let us start over," he said evenly. "Forget what we assumed we already know. If this model fails, Where does it fail first? The consultants immediately offered competing theories. Currency exposure, fuel prices, labor shortages, port congestion. Every explanation sounded reasonable. None felt complete. Margaret Holloway watched the exchange with quiet patience before finally asking a question that caught everyone off guard. Has anyone in this room noticed someone who has not spoken all evening? Several executives looked around in confusion before realizing she was looking toward Maya. One younger vice president laughed awkwardly. With respect, Margaret, she is serving dinner. Margaret smiled without losing her composure. Exactly, which means she has been listening instead of talking. The room became still once again. Maya froze for only a second after hearing her name. She immediately lowered her eyes and continued arranging cups, hoping the conversation would move on. Instead, Ethan walked a few steps closer. His expression no longer carried the quiet amusement from earlier. Carried curiosity. Miss Johnson, he said politely, may I ask you something? Every conversation in the dining room stopped. Even the nearby staff paused almost instinctively. Maya looked up with calm professionalism. Yes, sir. Ethan gestured toward the presentation screen. Earlier tonight, you looked at our shipping model as though something did not make sense. Was I imagining that? Maya hesitated. She knew every eye in the room had shifted toward her. She also knew exactly how unusual this moment had become. I did not intend to interrupt your meeting, she answered carefully. That was not my question, Ethan replied. His voice remained respectful, but direct. Did you notice something? Maya glanced briefly toward the restaurant manager standing near the entrance. The manager gave an almost invisible nod, silently assuring her that answering honestly would not create a problem. She drew one quiet breath before speaking. I only noticed one detail, sir. I could certainly be mistaken. Nobody interrupted. Nobody smiled this time. Ethan folded his hands. Please continue. Maya looked toward the digital map instead of the executives. The projected savings depend on customs processing times remaining consistent after the new international compliance framework takes effect next year. If those revisions are implemented on schedule, one of the primary shipping corridors in your model will experience significantly longer clearance periods. The transportation costs may decrease, but inventory delays could increase enough to erase most of the projected savings. When she finished speaking, the room remained completely silent. No dramatic reaction came. No one rushed to answer. Instead, several consultants instinctively opened their laptops at the exact same moment. Margaret leaned back slowly with the faintest smile. Ethan never took his eyes off Maya. For the first time that evening, he was no longer looking at a waitress. He was looking at someone whose quiet confidence sounded remarkably similar to the voice of experience. The quiet clicking of laptop keys gradually replaced every whispered conversation around the table. Consultants who had defended the presentation only minutes earlier searched through international compliance databases with growing urgency. One analyst frowned at his screen, refreshed the government bulletin twice, then slowly leaned back in his chair. Another opened an entirely different source, hoping to prove Maya Johnson mistaken. Instead, he found the same scheduled regulatory update waiting in plain sight. The information had never been hidden. It had simply been ignored. Ethan Carter watched every expression change without saying a single word. Years of leading global companies had taught him to recognize one unmistakable signal. When experts stopped arguing and started verifying, someone unexpected had probably told the truth. Finally, the lead consultant cleared his throat. His confidence had disappeared, replaced by quiet professionalism. She is correct, he admitted. The revised customs framework is scheduled to begin during the first quarter next year. We modeled the existing processing standards instead of the approved revisions. No one reacted immediately. The admission settled over the room like a slow-moving tide. The projected savings displayed across the giant screen no longer looked impressive. They looked incomplete. Margaret Holloway folded her hands with the satisfaction of someone who cared far more about accuracy than pride. How much does that change the forecast? She asked. Another analyst typed several figures before answering. If the implementation timeline remains unchanged, inventory delays alone could eliminate nearly 70% of the projected operational savings during the first 2 years. A few executives quietly exchanged astonished looks. One investor slowly removed his glasses and studied the presentation again as though seeing it for the first time. Ethan remained remarkably calm. He had built his reputation by solving expensive problems, not by pretending they never existed. Still, his attention remained fixed on Maya. She stood quietly beside the service station, hands folded in front of her apron, making no effort to draw attention to herself. She had not smiled after being proven correct. She had not looked around expecting recognition. She simply waited to see whether anyone needed more coffee. That unexpected humility impressed Ethan almost as much as her knowledge. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice carrying naturally across the room. "How did you recognize something an entire consulting team overlooked?" Maya hesitated. She never enjoyed becoming the center of attention. "I have always enjoyed studying international trade," she answered honestly. "During my breaks and after work, I read policy updates because they explain how small regulatory changes affect ordinary businesses and families. Sometimes a delay at one port becomes higher prices for people who never even hear about that port." The simplicity of her explanation surprised everyone. She had not spoken like someone trying to impress executives. She had spoken like someone who genuinely understood why global business mattered beyond quarterly profits. Ethan noticed the worn study folder still resting beneath her serving tray. "Are you taking classes?" he asked. Maya nodded gently. "Online graduate courses whenever I can afford another semester. It takes longer while working full-time, but I enjoy learning." One executive blinked in disbelief. "Graduate courses?" Maya smiled politely. "Yes, sir." Margaret could not hide her admiration. "Knowledge has always been willing to work harder than opportunity." The sentence lingered in the room. Several guests quietly reflected on how easily they had accepted assumptions based on a uniform instead of ability. Ethan looked toward the revised financial model still glowing on the presentation screen. Hundreds of millions of dollars had nearly been committed using incomplete information. A correction had arrived from the one person nobody had invited into the discussion. He slowly nodded, not to the consultants, not to the investors, but to Maya herself. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, yet it carried something far more valuable than public praise. It was the first moment that respect replaced assumption. And although no one realized it yet, the evening had only begun revealing why Maya Johnson understood international business far better than anyone could have imagined. For several long seconds, nobody returned to the presentation. The billion-dollar projections remained frozen on the screen, but they no longer commanded the room's attention. Instead, every thoughtful glance found its way back to Maya Johnson. She stood exactly where she had been a few moments earlier, holding an empty silver coffee pot with the same quiet composure she had carried throughout the evening. Nothing about her posture suggested she had just altered the direction of one of the largest negotiations in the room. She simply waited for the next guest who might need another cup of coffee. Ethan Carter found that detail impossible to ignore. Throughout his career, he had met brilliant executives who celebrated every small victory as though it were a personal performance. Maya had done the opposite. She had corrected an expensive mistake and immediately returned to serving dinner without asking for recognition. That kind of confidence could not be manufactured. It came from someone who did not need applause to believe in the value of what she knew. Ethan slowly walked toward the service station. The room watched in silence. "May I ask you one more question?" he said. Maya nodded respectfully. "Of course, sir. Why are you working here?" The question sounded simple, but everyone understood what he really meant. Someone capable of identifying a flaw that experienced consultants had overlooked did not fit the assumptions most people carried into the restaurant that evening. Maya smiled gently before answering. "Because this job pays my rent on time." A few quiet laughs eased the tension, but she continued before anyone misunderstood. "It also gives me flexibility. I study before work, after work, and during every break I can find. Progress is slower than I hoped, but it is still progress. Ethan listened carefully. You mentioned graduate courses. What are you studying? International business strategy, Maya replied. My concentration focuses on global supply chains and trade policy. One consultant looked genuinely surprised. Where? Maya answered without hesitation. New York University. I attend remotely while working full-time. Another executive leaned forward. If you have that background, why are you not already working for an international firm? Maya lowered her eyes briefly before answering with complete honesty. I interviewed at several companies. Most wanted candidates with experience that I could not obtain without first being hired. Eventually, bills became more urgent than interviews. No bitterness entered her voice. No complaint. She stated the facts the same way someone might describe tomorrow's weather. Margaret Holloway quietly shook her head. The world wastes extraordinary talent every single day because it mistakes opportunity for ability. Her words settled heavily across the table. Several guests looked down, reflecting on careers built with advantages they had rarely questioned. Ethan glanced once more at the revised financial model. The consultants were still adjusting forecasts based on Maya's observation. The projected savings had changed dramatically, yet the meeting itself had become far more valuable than anyone expected. He realized the evening was no longer about repairing a spreadsheet. It had become a lesson about leadership. A true leader, he reminded himself, was not the person with every answer. A true leader was willing to recognize the right answer regardless of where it came from. He looked back at Maya. When you noticed the error earlier, why did you not speak immediately? Maya paused before answering. Because I have learned that people usually trust the title before they trust the truth. I did not want anyone to feel embarrassed. I only hoped someone would eventually ask the right question. The room became perfectly still once again. There was no dramatic music, no raised voices, no triumphant celebration. There was only a simple sentence spoken with quiet grace. Yet those few words carried more wisdom than every expensive presentation shown that evening. Ethan Carter slowly nodded, understanding that the greatest lesson of the night had nothing to do with international business. It was about the cost of underestimating another human being before taking the time to truly see them. The atmosphere inside the private dining room had changed in a way no financial report could ever measure. Earlier that evening, people had looked through Maya Johnson as though she were simply another member of the restaurant staff moving silently between expensive conversations. Now every executive watched her with genuine curiosity. The shift was almost invisible, yet unmistakable. Respect had entered the room one quiet sentence at a time. Ethan Carter returned to his seat but did not reopen the presentation. Instead, he closed his laptop completely. The soft click echoed through the room, drawing everyone's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, he said calmly, we have spent nearly 3 hours discussing numbers. Tonight we have also been reminded that numbers are only as good as the people willing to question them. No one argued. The consultants nodded with surprising humility. Their embarrassment had gradually transformed into appreciation. Rather than defending a mistake, they had accepted it, corrected it, and moved forward. That willingness to learn impressed Ethan almost as much as Maya's insight. He turned toward the consulting team. Please revise every assumption connected to the compliance changes before tomorrow morning. I would rather postpone a billion-dollar decision than rush into the wrong one. Several investors exchanged approving glances. Margaret Holloway smiled quietly. She had invested in companies for decades, but evenings like this reminded her why character often predicted success more accurately than confidence ever could. As the meeting paused, one of the younger executives approached Maya with a respectful expression. May I ask you something? He said. Certainly, Maya replied. When you study after work, how many hours do you usually spend? She smiled modestly. Usually 3 or 4 hours each night. A little longer on my days off. His eyes widened. After an entire restaurant shift? Maya nodded. Dreams are usually built after the workday ends, not before it begins. Her answer quietly spread through the room. Another executive admitted that he had stopped reading industry journals years earlier because his schedule had become too busy. One investor confessed that she had not realized how quickly international regulations had evolved during the past 12 months. The conversation itself was changing. It was no longer centered on who had been wrong. It had become centered on how everyone could become better. Ethan listened carefully as the discussion evolved. Leadership, he realized, was contagious when humility entered the room first. He looked toward Maya once again. You mentioned that your graduate studies focus on international supply chains. What originally inspired that interest? Maya paused for only a moment before answering. My mother owned a small neighborhood grocery store when I was growing up. Every time imported products became delayed, prices increased. Families bought less. Sometimes she had to choose between raising prices or losing money. I realized that international business was never only about corporations. It affected ordinary people buying milk, medicine, school supplies, and groceries. That made me want to understand the system instead of simply complaining about it. Her explanation silenced the room more effectively than any presentation slide. She had never viewed global commerce as a game of profits alone. She had viewed it through the eyes of families trying to make every paycheck last until the end of the month. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly, reflecting on the countless boardroom discussions he had attended over the years. Quarterly earnings had always dominated the conversation. Rarely had anyone spoken first about the families behind the numbers. For the first time in many years, he realized that the most important perspective in the room had not come from the person with the highest salary. It had come from the person carrying the coffee tray. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories where the most overlooked people reveal the greatest strength, subscribe to Hidden Tables. Here, every story reminds us that courage, integrity, and kindness can come from the most unexpected places. Now, let's see what happened next. The dinner no longer felt like a negotiation. It felt like a classroom where every assumption was quietly being rewritten. The consultants continued updating their projections while investors discussed alternative shipping routes with a level of openness that had been missing earlier in the evening. Nobody seemed interested in protecting their pride anymore. They were interested in protecting the decision. Ethan Carter watched the transformation with genuine appreciation. Successful meetings, he had often believed, ended with agreements. Tonight, he realized the best meetings sometimes ended with better questions. As the revised figures slowly appeared on the large display, one of the senior logistics advisors spoke first. If we redirect the European shipments through Rotterdam during the transition period and delay the Southeast Asia expansion by 1/4, we recover nearly all of the projected savings. Another consultant immediately nodded. That also reduces compliance risk and gives regional partners additional preparation time. Margaret Holloway smiled. Now the strategy reflects reality instead of optimism. Ethan looked toward Maya Johnson once more. Would you mind joining us for just a few minutes? The request surprised everyone, including Maya herself. She hesitated respectfully. I am still on duty, sir. Before Ethan could respond, the restaurant manager stepped forward with a warm smile. Miss Johnson, I believe the dining room can spare you for a little while. She thanked him quietly before taking a seat at the far end of the table. It was the first time all evening she had sat down. She placed her hands neatly in her lap, careful not to assume she belonged there simply because she had been invited. Ethan noticed the gesture immediately. Humility, he thought, often revealed itself through the smallest actions. I am curious, he said. When you reviewed our presentation, was the compliance issue the only concern you noticed? Maya considered the question carefully. It was the most urgent one, she replied. There were also a few assumptions about supplier concentration that might become vulnerable if geopolitical conditions change unexpectedly. Several consultants immediately looked back toward their models. Which suppliers? One asked. Maya pointed politely toward a regional sourcing chart displayed on the screen. Nearly 40% of the projected inventory depends on 2 manufacturers located within the same transportation corridor. If a disruption affects that corridor, diversification becomes very limited. One consultant blinked in surprise before opening another report. After several moments, he slowly nodded. She is right again. We discussed supplier diversification last year but never updated the expansion model. Ethan leaned back thoughtfully. 2 independent observations. 2 significant risks. Neither had come from the expensive consulting package his company had commissioned. They had come from someone balancing graduate coursework with restaurant shifts. The contrast humbled him more than he expected. "Miss Johnson," Margaret asked gently, "what would you do differently if you were responsible for this expansion?" Maya looked around the table before answering. She did not speak quickly. She spoke carefully. "I would move more slowly at the beginning so the company could move much faster later. I would diversify suppliers before increasing volume. I would strengthen regional partnerships before announcing aggressive growth targets. Investors usually reward confidence. Markets usually reward preparation." The sentence settled across the room with remarkable clarity. Nobody interrupted. Nobody challenged her reasoning. Instead, several executives quietly wrote notes beside their printed reports. Ethan found himself smiling for the first time that evening. Not because someone had agreed with him, but because someone had challenged his organization to think more carefully. He realized that genuine expertise never announced itself with arrogance. It revealed itself through thoughtful questions, practical solutions, and the confidence to remain patient until someone was finally willing to listen. As the updated projections finished processing on the large display, the revised strategy appeared stronger, more resilient, and considerably more realistic than the version everyone had confidently praised only an hour earlier. The numbers had improved, but something even more valuable had changed. Every person in the room had begun measuring intelligence by insight instead of appearance, and that lesson would remain long after the financial forecasts were forgotten. The revised presentation finally appeared on the large screen, and this time the room responded differently. There was no applause, no premature celebration, no self-congratulatory remarks. Instead, there was something far rarer inside a room filled with accomplished executives. There was confidence built on evidence rather than assumption. Ethan Carter slowly reviewed every updated projection before looking around the table. The financial outlook was no longer as spectacular as the original proposal had promised, yet it was stronger in the one way that truly mattered: could survive reality. "This," Ethan said quietly, "is the version we should have started with." Nobody disagreed. Even the consulting team appeared relieved. They had not lost credibility by correcting their work. They had gained it by choosing accuracy over pride. Margaret Holloway watched the younger executives taking notes instead of checking their phones. The atmosphere had become unexpectedly collaborative. Every person in the room seemed to understand that tonight's greatest investment had not been financial. It had been intellectual humility. Ethan turned toward Maya Johnson once again. "I have another question, if you do not mind." Maya smiled politely. "Of course. What is the first lesson your graduate program taught about international business?" The room listened carefully. Maya thought for a moment before answering. "That every supply chain eventually becomes a human story." Several people looked surprised by the simplicity of her response. She continued, "Professors often teach us about logistics, regulations, contracts, and transportation networks. Those things matter. But eventually every delayed shipment becomes an empty pharmacy shelf, a manufacturer waiting for materials, or a family paying more for groceries. International business looks global on paper, but its consequences always become local." Silence settled gently across the table. The words were not dramatic. They were simply true. One investor slowly nodded. "I have spent 30 years evaluating multinational companies," he admitted. "I cannot remember hearing it explained that clearly." Maya smiled modestly. "My mother taught me that part, not the university." Ethan leaned forward with genuine curiosity. "Your mother owned the grocery store you mentioned earlier?" "Yes," Maya answered. She never used terms like supply chain resilience or market volatility. She simply knew that when imported products arrived late, neighborhood families had to stretch every dollar a little further. Watching her taught me that business decisions always reach people who never attend board meetings. Ethan reflected quietly on those words. Throughout his career, he had measured success through acquisitions, market share, shareholder value, and international expansion. Tonight, someone wearing a restaurant apron had reminded him why those numbers mattered in the first place. One of the consultants closed his laptop and spoke sincerely. "Miss Johnson, I owe you an apology. Earlier tonight, I assumed experience belonged only to the people sitting at this table." Maya answered with the same grace she had shown all evening. "You do not owe me an apology. We all make assumptions. The important part is deciding what we do after we discover they are wrong." Margaret smiled warmly. "That may be the wisest statement anyone has made tonight." Gentle laughter spread across the room, this time free from arrogance or discomfort. It sounded different because everyone was laughing together rather than at someone else. Ethan noticed the change immediately. Leadership, he realized, had quietly shifted from authority toward understanding. The meeting that had begun with expensive presentations and polished confidence had become something infinitely more valuable. It had become a room where people were finally willing to learn from one another. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city lights reflected across the glass towers of Manhattan with renewed clarity. Inside, the agreement waiting to be signed had become stronger than anyone expected, not because a billionaire had spoken, but because someone everyone had overlooked had been given the opportunity to finish a single sentence. The revised agreement was no longer treated as a document waiting for signatures. It had become the result of something much more meaningful. Every correction, every updated projection, and every thoughtful discussion reflected a room that had chosen wisdom over ego. Ethan Carter stood beside the panoramic windows overlooking Manhattan, watching the lights shimmer across the Hudson River. For years, he had believed that experience naturally gathered around boardroom tables. Tonight had quietly challenged that belief. He turned back toward the guests and spoke with a sincerity that surprised even himself. "I would like everyone to stay for just a few more minutes before we conclude." No one objected. In fact, the room seemed unusually eager to hear what came next. Ethan looked toward Maya Johnson, who had politely returned to standing after helping review the final projections. "Miss Johnson," he said, "would you do me the honor of joining us once more?" She hesitated only because she glanced toward her manager first. The manager smiled warmly and nodded. "Please," he said, "go ahead." Maya returned to the table, taking the same seat she had occupied earlier. She remained composed, careful, and humble, as though she still considered herself a guest in a conversation that had unexpectedly welcomed her. Ethan folded his hands before speaking. "Earlier tonight, I made an assumption about you that turned out to be completely wrong. I believed your uniform represented the limits of your knowledge. Instead, your knowledge exposed the limits of ours." The room became completely silent. Nobody expected one of the country's most respected chief executive officers to speak with such openness. Ethan continued without hesitation. "Leadership is not about pretending to have every answer. It is about recognizing the right answer when it appears, even if it arrives from the most unexpected place." Several executives quietly nodded in agreement. Margaret Holloway smiled with unmistakable pride, not because Maya had been proven right, but because humility had finally become the strongest voice in the room. Ethan reached into the leather portfolio beside his chair and removed a simple white business card. He placed it on the table instead of handing it directly to Maya. "This is not a reward," he said. "It is an invitation." Maya looked at the card without touching it. Printed beneath Ethan's name was a direct telephone number that very few people possessed. Around the table, several investors exchanged curious glances. Ethan explained before anyone could speculate. Next month, Carter Global Holdings begins assembling a strategic advisory fellowship for professionals with unconventional backgrounds and exceptional insight. We plan to recruit candidates from major consulting firms and business schools. Tonight reminded me that excellence is not always found where people expect to find it. Maya listened quietly, still saying nothing. Ethan smiled gently. "I would like you to apply, not because I feel sorry for you, not because of what happened tonight, because you earned the opportunity with your preparation long before any of us noticed." Maya finally spoke. "Thank you, sir. That means more than you probably realize." Ethan shook his head softly. No. The truth is that you have already given me something much more valuable. She looked at him with quiet curiosity. What is that? Ethan answered without looking away. A reminder that every leader should spend more time discovering hidden talent than displaying visible authority. The sentence settled naturally across the room. Nobody applauded. Nobody interrupted. Instead, one by one, the executives around the table quietly stood. Not because protocol demanded it, but because genuine respect often expresses itself through simple actions rather than dramatic words. For the first time that evening, Maya no longer looked like someone serving the room. She looked exactly like what she had always been. A professional whose preparation had finally met the opportunity she had spent years quietly earning. The meeting officially concluded, yet no one seemed eager to leave. Expensive contracts still rested on the polished walnut table, untouched for the moment, because every conversation had shifted away from financial projections and toward something far more memorable. People who had arrived expecting to witness another successful corporate negotiation were leaving with a lesson they had never planned to learn. Maya Johnson quietly picked up the white business card Ethan Carter had placed before her. She looked at it for only a second before carefully slipping it into the same study folder that had remained hidden beneath her serving tray throughout the evening. To everyone watching, the gesture seemed remarkably ordinary. To Maya, it represented years of early mornings, late nights, and sacrifices that very few people had ever noticed. Margaret Holloway approached her with a warm smile. "May I give you one piece of advice?" she asked. Maya nodded. "I would appreciate that." Margaret folded her hands gently. When opportunity finally arrives, many people believe they have become lucky. Do not ever believe that. Tonight was not luck. Tonight was preparation meeting recognition. Maya smiled gratefully. "Thank you. I will remember that." Nearby, several executives gathered around the updated presentation, discussing how the revised strategy would likely become a case study for future planning sessions inside their own companies. One consultant quietly admitted that he intended to change the way his team reviewed international regulatory risks from that point forward. Another confessed that he would begin inviting younger analysts to challenge senior recommendations before any major client presentation. Ethan listened from a distance, realizing that the evening's greatest return on investment could never appear on a balance sheet. It was already changing how experienced professionals approached leadership itself. As guests gradually prepared to leave, the restaurant manager walked over to Maya with an expression she had never seen before. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. She looked surprised. "For what?" He smiled with gentle honesty. "For thinking your future would always be inside this dining room. I should have realized long ago that you were preparing for something much bigger." Maya answered with her usual grace. "You gave me flexible hours when I needed them most. That helped more than you know." The manager laughed softly. "You always thanked me for the schedule. I never realized the schedule was helping you build a career." Across the room, Ethan finished speaking with several investors before walking toward Maya one final time. "There is one more thing I would like to tell you," he said. She listened attentively. "When I first noticed you tonight, I saw someone doing an excellent job serving dinner. That was all I allowed myself to see. I did not ask what you were studying. I did not ask what goals you carried home after every shift. I simply assumed the uniform explained your entire story." Maya answered with a calm smile that carried neither resentment nor triumph. "Most people do, sir." Ethan nodded slowly. "That realization may become one of the most valuable lessons of my career." He extended his hand. Maya accepted it with quiet confidence. There was no dramatic moment, no cheering crowd, no cameras recording the exchange. It was simply a handshake between two professionals who now understood one another through respect instead of assumption. Around them, the final guests quietly gathered their coats, while the city beyond the windows sparkled beneath a clear night sky. Earlier that evening, those same lights had overlooked a room filled with certainty. Now they overlooked something much stronger. Humility, curiosity, and earned respect had taken the place of pride. And although the contract signed that night would eventually influence international business across several continents, The lesson everyone carried home proved far more enduring. The greatest opportunities are often hidden behind the people the world forgets to notice, waiting patiently for someone willing to ask one sincere question before making one careless assumption. The restaurant slowly returned to its familiar rhythm after the last guests departed. Staff cleared crystal glasses, folded linen napkins, and dimmed the lights that had illuminated one of the most remarkable evenings anyone could remember. To everyone else, it had simply been another successful private event. To the handful of people who had witnessed the conversations unfold, it had become something they would quietly remember for years. Maya Johnson changed out of her uniform in the employee locker room with the same calm routine she followed every evening. She carefully placed her folded red apron inside her bag, zipped the worn study folder beside it, and paused when she noticed Ethan Carter's business card tucked between the pages of her international trade notes. She smiled softly before closing the folder. Nothing about the card changed the discipline that had carried her this far. Tomorrow morning she would still wake before sunrise. She would still review coursework before class. She would still complete another restaurant shift. Opportunity had arrived, but preparation would continue. Outside, the cool Manhattan air carried the quiet sounds of late evening traffic as Maya walked toward the subway station. She preferred public transportation because it gave her 40 uninterrupted minutes to read. Sitting beside the train window, she reopened the same graduate textbook she had been studying earlier that week. A fellow passenger glanced briefly at the business articles covering the pages before returning to his own phone. Nobody recognized her. Nobody knew what had happened a few hours earlier. Maya appreciated that. Recognition was pleasant, but consistency built the future she wanted. Across the city, Ethan Carter arrived home much later than usual. His penthouse overlooked the river, yet instead of reviewing tomorrow's meetings, he sat alone in his study reflecting on the evening. His executive assistant had already forwarded updated financial projections based on the revised strategy, showing that the partnership remained profitable despite the necessary adjustments. The numbers mattered. They always would. Yet Ethan found himself thinking less about projected revenue and more about one simple sentence Maya had spoken. People usually trust the title before they trust the truth. He realized how often that pattern quietly shaped hiring decisions, promotions, and even boardroom discussions inside his own company. The following morning, before his first executive meeting began, Ethan requested a complete review of the company's recruitment process. Senior managers gathered around the conference table expecting another discussion about international expansion. Instead, Ethan asked a different question. How many exceptional candidates have we overlooked because their resumes did not match our expectations? The room fell silent. Human resources executives exchanged thoughtful glances before admitting that traditional recruiting often favored familiar career paths over unconventional talent. Ethan nodded. Then we need to change that. He announced a new initiative expanding fellowship opportunities for professionals balancing work with higher education, community college graduates, career changers, and applicants whose abilities might never appear fully on a single page of credentials. The proposal surprised many executives, but no one questioned the reasoning behind it. News of the initiative quietly spread throughout the company during the following weeks. Employees welcomed the change, recognizing that leadership had become more willing to discover potential rather than merely reward polished backgrounds. Meanwhile, Maya continued living exactly as she always had. She attended lectures, completed assignments, worked evening shifts, and saved every extra dollar toward finishing graduate school. She told almost no one about the dinner or Ethan's invitation because she believed lasting success should never depend on one extraordinary evening alone. It should be supported by thousands of ordinary days spent preparing when nobody was watching. Somewhere between those quiet mornings of studying and those long evenings serving guests, the distance between her present and her future had begun to disappear. Not because fate had suddenly changed her life, but because years of unseen discipline had finally found a moment willing to recognize it. 6 months passed more quickly than anyone expected. Seasons changed across Manhattan, markets continued rising and falling, cargo ships crossed oceans, and boardrooms remained filled with ambitious conversations. Yet some of the most meaningful changes happened quietly, far away from headlines and quarterly earnings reports. Maya Johnson completed another semester of graduate school with outstanding results while continuing to work evening shifts at the same restaurant. She accepted the Strategic Advisory Fellowship at Carter Global Holdings, attending weekend workshops and contributing research between classes and work. She never stopped carrying notebooks filled with handwritten observations. She never believed success had arrived simply because one extraordinary evening had changed the direction of her life. Success, she reminded herself every morning, still depended on showing up prepared. Across town, Ethan Carter noticed something equally important inside his own organization. The expanded fellowship initiative attracted applicants from backgrounds his company had rarely considered before. Veterans returning to civilian careers, first-generation college students, working parents finishing degrees at night, community college graduates, and professionals changing industries brought fresh ideas that challenged long-standing assumptions. Innovation did not increase because the company hired more people. It increased because the company began listening to more perspectives. During one quarterly leadership conference, Ethan invited several fellows to present improvement proposals directly to senior executives. Maya was among them. She stood confidently before a room filled with vice presidents and directors, no longer wearing a restaurant apron but a simple navy business suit that reflected professionalism rather than extravagance. Her presentation focused on strengthening supplier resilience through regional diversification and community partnerships. She spoke with the same calm clarity she had demonstrated on the night everyone first underestimated her. When the presentation concluded, the room responded with genuine applause. Not because she had delivered dramatic promises, but because every recommendation reflected careful research, practical thinking, and respect for the people affected by business decisions. After the meeting ended, Margaret Holloway approached Ethan with a knowing smile. "Do you remember the first time she spoke?" she asked. Ethan smiled quietly. "I remember the first time I finally listened." They both laughed softly, recognizing how much that single difference had changed. A few weeks later, Maya returned to the restaurant for dinner with her mother, who had finally sold the small neighborhood grocery store and was enjoying a well-earned retirement. The same dining room looked almost unchanged. Crystal chandeliers still reflected warm light across polished tables. Servers moved gracefully between guests. Conversations floated through the room exactly as they had months earlier. The only real difference was invisible. New employee training now emphasized something the restaurant manager insisted every new hire understand. Respect every guest. Respect every coworker. And never assume you know someone's story because of the uniform they wear. As Maya and her mother prepared to leave, a young waitress nervously approached their table. "Excuse me," she said with a shy smile. "The manager told me you used to work here. I am studying economics during the day. Sometimes I wonder if I am dreaming too big." Maya looked at the young woman and immediately recognized the uncertainty she herself had carried for years. She smiled warmly before answering. "Dreams are not measured by where you start. They are measured by whether you keep preparing after everyone else stops believing." The waitress thanked her quietly, her eyes filled with renewed determination. Maya watched her return to work, carrying a tray with the same quiet confidence she once carried every evening. As she stepped outside into the cool New York night, Ethan's words from months earlier returned to her mind. Leadership is recognizing the right answer no matter where it comes from. She smiled gently, realizing the lesson belonged to everyone now. Because power can open doors. Wealth can fill rooms. Titles can command attention. But character earns trust. Preparation creates opportunity. And the people the world overlooks today may become the very people who help shape a better tomorrow. She had not argued. She had not boasted. She had simply been ready when the moment arrived. And sometimes that is the greatest victory of all. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Hidden Table and join a community that believes true character is revealed not by power or status, but by courage, integrity, and kindness. Thank you for watching, and until next time, we will save you a seat at the hidden tables.